Hi, this is Angela Tutt, and this is my reflective analysis video. How have course readings been translated to impact your students? Formative assessment must be the force driving the decision-making and planning process in your classroom. It must occur continuously during the learning process so as to guide the next steps. The formative assessment process of the Formative 5 has shifted my thinking from using assessment only to determine what students know to using it for guiding instruction. Pre-planning, discussions, observations, or individual interviews have a potential to greatly increase not only depth of learning, but also student accountability and direct involvement in their learning. This method can be used daily and increases the productivity of the mathematical discussion during rich problem-solving tasks. The 5 practices also gave practical ways to orchestrate productive mathematical discussions during math tasks or after an exploration, instead of defaulting to what Smith and Stein call a show-and-tell session. How has the process of clinical interviews informed your own instruction of mathematics? According to William, what matters in formative assessment is how the evidence obtained during the assessment is used to guide next steps or shape a lesson. This is a complete shift in the way we lesson plan, which typically takes place before the unit ever begins. However, if we are using the above thought processes from William, then each day we should be changing and molding our lessons to fit the needs of our learners based on previously observed misunderstandings during small group or individual interviews. If you would have asked me before taking this course whether I truly knew where each and every one of my students were in their mathematical learning, I would have told you without a doubt I absolutely did. The experience that I had with my clinical interviews informed me that I had only been scratching the surface of what my students knew. I will be incorporating this process into my daily teaching to inform me of any challenges or misunderstandings students have, as well as whether their understanding is superficial or conceptually sound. How have formative assessment strategies informed your own instruction and your students' learning of mathematics? Margaret Heritage beautifully explains the importance of ongoing formative assessment for student achievement, stating, "What is missing in assessment practice in this country is the recognition that, to be valuable for instructional planning, assessment needs to be a moving picture, a video stream rather than a periodic snapshot." Her term, "a moving picture," resonated with me as it perfectly described how I felt during the process of our clinical interviews. I was able to see their depth of understanding unfold and in action, as opposed to a static snapshot on a state test. Previously, I had understood that formative assessment was connected and used to determine to what extent my students were mastering their objectives. However, after this course, I now know how vital it is in the planning of my instruction. All 5 of the processes listed in the Formative 5 are necessary if you are going to get a clear picture of what a student knows. How have the Hinge questions been infused into your questioning and interactions with your student? The Hinge question seems to be one of the most important glimpses into our students' thinking. This part of the learning is where teachers can attain instant feedback about where their students are in their understanding. It also provides a fork in the road, giving a teacher the option to either continue with the direction of instruction or veer to the right and address misconceptions. You can think of this idea as a temperature gauge for whether the student was on the right path with his reasoning or if there needs to be reteach. I plan on using this technique daily in my classroom to direct next steps in my instruction. One of my most surprising results came from the Hinge question I used for interview number 2. My student had made such progress with his understanding, but when I tasked him with a new problem, he had great difficulty transferring to a new problem situation. In the past, I would have overestimated this student's understanding in the beginning, when really I needed to revisit this the next day. How do you anticipate incorporating into your instruction what you have learned about questioning and students' learning of math through the experiences of planning and implementing clinical interviews? Anticipation seems to be where I struggle most when planning for an interview, which requires a ton more thinking and reasoning than I had assumed. In the 5 practices, they identify 3 parts to anticipation: likely student strategies, teacher response to student work, an order in which student strategies will be shared with the class. The hardest part for me is determining all the likely strategies. I found that in my first interview that I didn't plan for my student to create a list, so it took me a while to align my questioning with my intended learning goals. Keeping those goals at the forefront of my thought process was helpful, though, and allowed me to choose a new path of questioning. Here are the 2 activities that I used for both Interview 1 and Interview 2. In the first interview, we went over the problem. I gave them time to struggle with the task, and they answered a couple questions in regards to finding a rule. At the very end, their hinge question was what I had originally said was part 2, which was explain how you could find the number of blocks in any row. Interview 2 incorporated what we did in Interview 1, except for this time they were going to put the information that they found into a table, and they were going to identify the process behind what was going on in the pattern. During my first interview, I was able to get my student to show his work and reveal his mathematical processes that I wouldn't have known had I not pressed the issue. It was early on in his learning of algebraic patterns, so most of the questioning remained at the making math visible level below. I was able to build to reflection and justification during both the first and second interview by making him explain how you could find the number of blocks in any row. I also didn't make enough connections to the learning objectives, so I noticed at the end of our interview he seemed a little unsure of what he had just demonstrated to me. In interview number 2, I was able to direct most of my questioning with my learning goal in mind. One major change that I would make in my future instruction of algebraic patterns is to start with manipulatives so that students can experience the patterns for themselves. I know this would have helped Tyler immensely, as he had a hard time connecting his numbers with the math behind the scenes. During the first interview, the student began by making a list of possible inputs and outputs. He determined rather quickly that there was a mathematical relationship between the row number and the total number of blocks, but kept confusing himself and revising his thinking. He knew that each row went up by 2, but he struggled to determine what he called the shortcut, or pattern that would help him find the answer quicker. He correctly identified that if you multiply the row by 2 and subtract 1, the row number by 2 and subtract 1, you will get the number of blocks in the longest row. However, once the visual was removed and we were moving on to task number 2, student struggled with connecting his process with the pattern he had uncovered from the previous lesson. I had him go ahead and draw the boxes that represent the process to try and bridge the gap, which helped him eventually make a connection and fill in the process column. What was enlightening to me as a teacher is that in a classroom setting, I may have passed over him thinking he totally understood the concept without pressing deeper to see if his connections were authentic. I would have found that he actually needed more explanation, manipulatives, or visuals to help him connect to the math. This hinge question verified what I had suspected earlier in the table, which was that this student definitely needed manipulatives or visuals to help him connect to the math. He was still struggling to understand how each step was changing mathematically. He first tried to incorrectly generalize the rule that we had previously used for the other problem. Then he realized that this was not going up by 2, but this one was going up by 4, but struggled to come up with the number of blocks, or how to find the number of blocks. The next day, depending on how the rest of the class did, I would either pull him aside with some Unifix cubes or back up the whole class and lead them through the actual building of each of the steps and filling out the table at the same time to see if we could put some meaning behind the patterns in the table. In conclusion, although teachers assess student progress all throughout their day, this unplanned assessment is meaningless unless there is a purposeful planning and implementation. So many times I have led discussions off the cuff, jumping around concepts according to the response of students, thinking this was student-centered teaching. Formative assessment must be the guide you use to plan and teach your lessons. Productive mathematical discussions also need to be planned in advance, using anticipation, monitoring students' work on the task, and carefully selecting the order in which they will share out. Both these practices will provide useful feedback to our students, which will shape their learning experiences every day in their math classes. Thank you so much.